In the last 2 episodes, we covered the basics. First, we explored the essential foundations before diving into materials, and then we created a simple material for the trash can. But we hit a roadblock. Our object didn't have any thickness, so the texture was showing up on both the front and back faces. Not exactly what we wanted, right? Our goal was to apply a different material, a white plastic, for the backside without adding thickness to the object. To solve this, we turned to the shader editor. After getting a basic understanding of how it works and playing around with some simple nodes, we used the geometry node to fix this problem, and we almost finished the material for the bin. Everything was going great until we hit another obstacle. What happens if we want to change the scale of the texture on the object, or maybe move it around on the surface? Why didn't we deal with the UV mapping during the whole process, and yet we managed to assign the material to our object without any major issues? Well, in this episode, we're going to tackle the UV editor, learn how to UV unwrap our trash can, and finalize its material once and for all. Okay, since this episode is directly connected to the previous 2, make sure you've watched those before continuing. Alright folks, ready? Let's get started. Okay, before we jump in, let me remind you, if UV unwrapping is new to you, this episode might feel a bit unfamiliar or even strange at first. That's totally normal. Here's my advice. Just follow along with me step by step. Do every action I do, practice with me, and I promise it'll all start to make sense. You'll be amazed at how quickly you'll get the hang of it. Also, if you haven't already joined our Discord server, now is the perfect time. You can share your thoughts, ask questions, or just chat with us about the course. I've dropped the Discord link in the description below. Alright, at the end of the last episode, we landed here and clicked on this icon to switch the region to the UV editor. The UV editor is a pretty simple editor. Like other editors in Blender, it has a side panel that you can toggle with the N key, and navigating inside it is just like the shader editor. You can pan using the middle mouse button and zoom in or out while scrolling your mouse wheel. Alternatively, you can hold Ctrl and middle mouse button and move the mouse to zoom in and out. Now inside this editor, we don't see much, just this square in the middle. Even if we select objects in the scene, nothing really changes here. So here's the first thing to keep in mind. To view the UVs of your object in the UV editor, you must be in edit mode. Let me show you. I'm gonna start by selecting the bin object, then press tab to switch to edit mode. Whether your mouse is over the viewport or the UV editor, it doesn't matter. Pressing tab will toggle between object mode and edit mode in both. Once we switch to edit mode, you'll immediately notice some changes in the UV editor. Instead of just that square, we can now see the texture of our object. Plus, depending on which component of the mesh are selected, you'll see those components highlighted here in the UV editor. Another subtle change happens in the header at the top of the UV editor window. You'll see more options and icons appear when in edit mode, and fewer when you go back to object mode. Try it out, press tab to see the difference. Alright, switching back to edit mode again, I'll make sure the face select mode is active up here, and as an example, I'll click on this face to select it. Instantly, you'll see that the same face appear in the UV editor. Now if I hold shift and click on this other face, it gets added to my selection, and boom, we can see it pop up in the UV editor too. Notice how these faces correspond to a specific part of the texture space shown in the UV editor? They're displaying exactly that part of the texture on the 3D object. Let's take it a step further. If I hold Alt and click on this edge, I can select the entire ring of faces on the bin object. And now, the UV editor shows only the portion of the texture space that's being mapped to these selected faces. But wait, why is this shape rectangular? What even is this? And who made it? We didn't create this ourselves, did we? Let's take a step back and tackle this like the philosophers of old by asking the right questions. Here is the dilemma. The image we're using as a texture is 2D, but the object we're applying it to is 3D. So, the big question is, how do we wrap a 2D image around a 3D object? The easiest way to handle this is by unfolding or flattening our 3D object on a flat surface. For example, with this bin object, we can simply mark one of these edges as a cutting line, then flatten it out like this in the UV editor. By doing this, we can decide which part of the texture will be displayed on the flattened surface and ultimately on the 3D object itself. Pretty clever, right? This cutting line we create is called a seam, and the process of flattening the mesh is known as unwrapping. Together, this whole process is called UV unwrapping. When we unwrap a mesh's UVs, we're essentially mapping the 3D object's coordinates onto a 2D space. The software uses these coordinates to understand precisely which part of the 2D image should be applied to which face of the 3D object. When this data is used to project the image, the process is called UV mapping. So, UV mapping is the technique of projecting 2D images onto 3D models. Now, here's an interesting point. If I select the bean object, press Tab to enter edit mode, and then press A to select everything, you'll see that our object has already been unwrapped. Why is that? Well, in Blender, when you add primitive objects like cubes, spheres, or cylinders from the Add menu using Shift-A, they come with default UV unwrapping. Since we start modeling this object from a cylinder, the current UVs belong to the original cylinder shape. That's why when we assigned a texture earlier, it was displayed almost correctly on the object. But here's the catch. We don't always work with simple shapes like cylinders. As soon as we start using tools like extrude, bevel, and others to add faces, the shape of the mesh changes, right? However, the UVs of the original primitive remain unchanged. This mismatch means that when we assign the texture to more complex models with lots of modifications, the texture doesn't display properly on the mesh. Now, let me show you something else. With the bean object still selected, if I click on this icon, Object Data Properties, you can see a section called UV Maps. If I click on the minus icon here, it deletes the UV map for the selected object, and immediately, you'll notice that the texture disappears from the object. Why? Because Blender was using the default UV map to display the texture. Now that we've removed the UV data, Blender has no idea how to map the texture onto the mesh. Now, of course, there are various ways to project 2D images onto meshes, but UV mapping is one of the most common and practical methods. That's why mastering this skill can be a significant strength in your workflow. Alright, now that we've deleted the object's UV map, let's take action. Let's see how we can create a new UV map for this object. After all, the best way to understand and learn something is by doing it. The first step is to figure out how to mark seams and then unwrap the object. Without marking seams, unwrapping won't give us good results. Let's first try unwrapping without marking seams to see what happens. To make things easier, I'll temporarily hide the plain object. Alright, to unwrap, first you need to select the faces you want to unwrap. To do that, I'm going to press Tab to go back to edit mode and then press A to select all the faces. After that, we can either find the unwrap option in the UV menu here or use the shortcut U, which brings up the UV unwrap menu. So I'm going to press U and go to unwrap, and here we have different unwrapping methods, but for now we're not going to deal with them. It's enough to select angle based, and immediately you'll see two things happen. First, since we had deleted the UV data, a UV map gets added here. Second, the object's UV gets unwrapped. But it's unwrapped in a way that makes it look like the object has been squashed and flattened instead of being properly opened up. And if you look at the texture on the object, let me go back to object mode by pressing Tab so you can see it better. You'll notice that the image is deformed and isn't projected correctly onto the object. The reason for this is we didn't mark any seams. So, to prevent this, we need to mark seams on the object before unwrapping. Marking seams is really easy. You just need to think about where to cut the object so it unwraps as flat as possible. For this cylinder object, it's very simple. We can select any of these edges around it, right-click, and choose Mark Seam, or we can press U again to bring up the UV mapping menu and select Mark Seam from there. After marking the seam, if I click anywhere in the empty space, you can see that the edge is highlighted in red. This indicates that it's been marked as a seam. That's it. However, keep in mind that wherever you place a seam, it's where the pattern of a seamless texture will break. So, the key points to remember about seams are: use as few seams as possible and try to hide seams in places that aren't visible to the camera or audience, such as the back of the object or areas facing a wall. For example, on this cylinder object, we can place the seam on any vertical edge and then rotate the object in the scene so the seam faces the wall. This way, the seam is hidden from view. No worries, right? Now, if we recall, we used the bevel tool for the bottom part of this bin. So we need to select the entire edge loop at the bottom and mark it as a seam. To do that, I'm going to hold Alt and click on this edge to select the loop, press U, and choose Mark Seam. Okay, let's unwrap it now to see the result. I'm going to press A to select all the faces, then U, and select Unwrap with the angle-based option. As you can see, we still didn't get the correct result. Why? It's because this face at the bottom of the bin is preventing the unwrapping from working properly. So we need to mark more seams. Alright, I'm going to hold Alt, click on this edge loop, press U, and select Mark Seam again. Now this edge loop is marked as a seam. Let's try unwrapping one more time. I'm going to press A, then U, select Unwrap, and again choose the angle-based option. Okay, now you can see that the UV has been unwrapped correctly, but the problem is that the texture's orientation is currently displayed incorrectly. To fix it, simply click on an empty area to deselect everything, then hover your mouse over the part of the UV map that corresponds to the body of the bean and press L to select the linked island. Pay attention, each of these separate and unwrapped sections is called an island. So, I hovered my mouse over this island, pressed L, and now I'm going to press R for rotation, and then I'll type -90 and hit enter. Now you can see that the texture is oriented correctly. Next, you can press G for grab or move, and move this island around. For example, you can place it here inside the UV grid for now. At this point, you might be wondering, wait a minute, why is the texture still visible on the object even when I move this island outside the UV grid? Isn't the texture supposed to stop showing outside the grid? Keep in mind that by default, when you use a texture, it repeats itself in all 4 directions of the UV grid. This is the default behavior for imported images, and it can be changed if needed. So even if you move the UV island outside the grid, you'll still see the texture. However, for now, remember that the UV islands should not go outside the UV grid. Don't worry about why just yet. Okay, let's continue and move on to the next step. As you can see, even though we've marked the seams correctly, the texture on the object is stretched and doesn't look proportional. Why do you think that is? If you look closely, you'll notice that the length of the object is greater than the length of the UV island. Let me press G and move this island a bit lower. Okay, so this UV island needs to be stretched vertically to match the length of the object. Right? To do this, simply press S for scale. Now, since we're working in this 2D editor, there's no third dimension here, only 2 axes. We have the horizontal axis, X, which is called U in UV space, and the vertical axis, Y, which is called V in UV space. That's right, UV replaces the X and Y axis to avoid confusion with the 3D axis. Ha, see? The term UV map sounded scary for no reason. So, after pressing S, you just need to press Y. Be careful not to press Z like you would in 3D space. It won't do anything here. So, I'm going to press Y and move my mouse. While keeping an eye on the texture displayed on the object, I'll adjust the length until the texture's proportions look similar to those of the image in the UV editor. Simple as that. Now, in the next step, we need to arrange these UV islands within the UV grid. To do this, we can either manually place the islands in the UV grid, or we can use packing. Since packing makes our job much easier, let's arrange the islands in the UV grid using packing. For this, just move your mouse into the UV editor and press A to select all the islands, because we want to pack all of them, right? Now, here's a very important tip. Keep in mind that selecting faces or components in the 3D viewport does not mean the corresponding UV islands are also selected in the UV editor. For example, if I click here in an empty space, you'll see that even though the faces of the object are selected in the viewport, nothing is selected here in the UV editor. Why? Because if something is selected in the UV editor, you should see it highlighted in orange, right? So, pay close attention to this. The UV editor only deals with the texture coordinates on the mesh. It doesn't modify the mesh itself. That's why, even though the faces were selected in the viewport, I moved my mouse to the UV editor and pressed A to select the UV islands. However, if you want the components you select in the viewport to also be selected in the UV editor, you just need to activate this option here, the sync option. When this is active, any component you select in either the viewport or the UV editor will also be selected in the other. Personally, I like to have this option enabled. Okay, now I'm going to press A, and as you can see, both islands are selected. Next, from the UV menu, I'll click Pack Islands, and the Pack Islands settings window will appear. Now, without changing any of the settings, I click Pack, and as you can see, it moves the islands and tries to place them neatly within the grid. But what's happened here is that it rotated this island, which caused the texture orientation on the object to change again. I want the packing to happen without rotating the islands. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo, then go back to the Pack Islands menu. And this time in the settings, I'm going to uncheck the rotate option to prevent the islands from being rotated during packing. Then I'll click Pack again. And now we can see that it packed the islands without rotating them. And the texture orientation remains correct. Great! That's how easily we UV unwrapped our object. So, the entire UV process can be summed up in 4 steps. First, we mark the seams. Second, we select all components by pressing A. Then press U and choose unwrap. Third, we ensure that the texture proportions are correct. No stretching or squishing. If there is any, we fix it by adjusting the scale of the UV islands and, if needed, correcting their rotation. Finally, in the fourth step, we select all the islands, go to the UV menu, click Pack Islands, make sure the Rotate option is turned off, and then click Pack to arrange the islands neatly inside the UV grid. That's it. Simple as that. Now, here's a very important tip. Keep in mind that the UV unwrapping usually comes after the 3D modeling phase, and it's typically followed by the material creation phase. However, I intentionally introduced the UV process after showing you the material phase so you'd better understand the issue that can arise and how to handle them. Since UV unwrapping comes after modeling, you need to ensure that your model's topology is as finalized as possible before unwrapping. Why? Because if you make changes to the mesh after UV unwrapping, you need to redo the UV unwrap. When the mesh changes, the UV mapping must be updated to match the new geometry. Makes sense, right? Of course, this doesn't mean you're doomed if you realize after unwrapping that the topology needs changes. It happens all the time. It's normal. Just try to minimize these instances as much as you can. For example, the topology of this trash bin we created is quite dense. Ideally, we should have modeled it with fewer faces and then added a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it out later, right? However, for this object, we'll skip that step. But in future episodes, we'll make sure to consider this step, optimizing the mesh, before moving on to UV unwrapping for the objects we'll work on later. Alright, let's continue. I'll switch back to object mode using Tab, and to make sure we've mastered UV unwrapping, let's UV unwrap this rim object. First, I'm going to select it and switch to edit mode using Tab. And you can see that since we originally created this object using a torus, it already has a default UV map. So I'm going to go to the object data properties, and in the UV map section, I'm going to click the minus icon to delete the UV map. Now we are ready for the first step, marking the seams. For this mesh, the best place to hide the seam is here, where the rim connects to the bin, right? To make this process easier, I'm gonna bring my mouse here and scroll, and click on this icon to enable solid display so we can see the edges more clearly. I'm gonna also hide the bin object for now. Next, I'm gonna hold Alt and click on this edge, which selects the entire edge loop. And now if I toggle the bin object visibility on and off, you're gonna see that this edge loop is in a spot where the camera is unlikely to focus. It's not a visible area, so it's a great choice for a seam. Now, I'll press U and choose Mark Seam. Okay, now let's move on to the second step, unwrapping. I'm going to press A to select all the components, then press U, choose Unwrap, and select Angle Based. Alright, you can see that it's unwrapped into a ring shape. To flatten this further, we need to mark another seam along an edge ring. It's best to place this seam exactly where we marked it for the bin object. To do this, and make the bin object visible, switch back to object mode, select the bin and go into edit mode, and you can see the seam is located here. Okay, I'm going to exit edit mode, select the rim object and go back to edit mode. Holding Alt, I'm going to click on this edge to select the edge ring, press U and choose Mark Seam. Then I'm going to press A, then U, unwrap, and again select Angle Based. And that's it. The rim object is now unwrapped, and it's also packed neatly into the UV grid. Note that when you unwrap an object, Blender automatically packs the UV islands by default. If you don't rotate or remove the UV islands, there is no need to pack them again. But if you make any transformations to the UV islands, you can select all of them using A and click Pack Islands in the UV menu. That's how we UV unwrapped the rim object. So, is that it for UV mapping? Is it really that simple? Well, yes and no. The basic concept is indeed this simple. However, there are many important and advanced techniques for each of these steps I've shown you, but you don't need to worry about those for now. We'll gradually explore these advanced topics in future episodes of the course. Now I'm going to move my mouse here and scroll and switch back to material preview mode. Now, even though we've UV unwrapped both meshes, we still haven't achieved our goal. How can we move or scale the texture? We know that in the UV editor, we can move the UV islands to adjust the texture's position on the object, or scale the islands to change the texture's size, and even rotate them. But we also know that we shouldn't move the UV islands outside the UV grid. After all, that's why we packed them neatly inside it. So what should we do now? Another week of waiting for the new episode of BlenderTutorial to drop? Well, if you're this eager and excited to keep learning, why wait for the next episode? Let's continue. Alright, for what we want to achieve, we need to revisit our good friend, the shader editor. So I've switched from the UV editor to the shader editor. Let's make sure the bean object is selected so we can proudly admire the amazing shading network we created in the previous episode. Now, to control the size and position of the texture on our object based on the UV data we've created, we need to get familiar with two new nodes. The first one is the mapping node. So I'm going to press Shift A and type mapping and add it here. As you can see, this node has three inputs at the bottom: location, rotation, and scale, which are pretty self-explanatory, right? Now we just need to connect the vector output of the mapping node to the vector input of our texture image node. But as soon as we do this, you'll notice that the texture disappears from the object, and we can see the effect of changes like adjusting the scale in the mapping node. So we need to tell the mapping node what data to use for its transformations, right? As you can see, its vector input isn't connected to anything, meaning it's not processing any data. So it outputs nothing through its vector output. And that's why we're seeing no results. So we need to tell it to use the UV data of our object for mapping. To do that, I'm going to press Shift A and type texture coordinate and add the texture coordinate node here. This node has several outputs, each representing a different texture coordinate. For now, we need the UV texture coordinate, right? So don't worry about the other outputs for now. We'll explore them when we need to. Here, we'll simply connect the UV output of the texture coordinate node to the vector output of the mapping node. And with that, you'll see that the texture is back on our object. So the texture coordinate node is passing the UV data we created for the object to the mapping node. Now, for example, if I hold Shift, click and hold the left mouse button on the x-axis of the scale and adjust it, you'll see that we can easily change the texture's scale along this axis. Alright, I'll undo that with Ctrl Z, and since we want to scale the texture uniformly, I'll click and drag downwards to highlight all three axes, then hold Shift and move the mouse to adjust the scale. Okay. Now, if you'd like, you can also easily adjust the texture's rotation or location using the properties here. Alright, I'll undo those changes with Ctrl Z to reset everything to its default state. Now here's the important note. These two nodes, texture coordinate and mapping, are incredibly useful and commonly used when creating materials. They're so essential that there is even a shortcut for them. Let me delete these two nodes, select the image texture node, and use the shortcut Ctrl T. As you can see, it automatically adds both nodes and connects them properly. But if you try pressing Ctrl T, nothing will happen. Why? Because you haven't enabled the Node Wrangler add-on yet. What? I haven't mentioned it in this course before? Well, that's totally understandable. This add-on is specifically for material creation and is extremely important, so make sure you enable it. To do this, as always, go to Edit menu, then to Preferences, click on the Add-ons tab, and search for Node Wrangler and enable it here. Now make sure to select the image texture node here and press Ctrl T. Now you see that these nodes are added automatically. Once again, this add-on is super useful and essential. It provides a lot of handy features for material creation in the shader editor, one of which is this Ctrl T shortcut for adding these two nodes. Alright everyone, we're all done with this object. Here's something very important. The first 3 episodes of Season 2 of BlenderTutorial are extremely important. Be sure to watch and fully understand these 3 episodes, as grasping the upcoming content relies heavily on them. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you in the next one. Take care everyone.